Hi, this next lecture is about the impact of social location and worldview on multicultural counseling frameworks. Now, this is going to be a deep lecture. It might be one of those that you want to watch a couple times because, what happens whenever you're in a master's in counseling and they present a multicultural framework, it is one of many frameworks, and they're teaching you to be a master of their framework. Now, I've done a lot of doctoral level work on cross-cultural perspectives and things along those lines. And part of what I've done is critiqued a lot of different frameworks. So that's part of what I'm going to be doing in this course. And it's really important to our students for a variety of reasons. Why discuss worldview and social location? City Vision students in the locations they work have radically different views towards multicultural counseling. In many ways, it's almost like, the Tower of Babel. They're not even speaking the same language. So taking a course like this and having the diversity of our students and the diversity of perspectives, we have to kind of define some things, right? So here's some key factors to think about in how we're approaching this course. So City Vision needs to prepare students to work in a wide range of environments that may have very different frameworks towards multicultural counseling. Some of our students are going to work in, secular counseling environments that may be very left-wing. Others may work in, ministries that are, extremely not just theologically conservative, but politically conservative. And you don't know where you're going to work throughout your career. It may be that you are going to be, at your current organization for 30 years, or you may be in a Christian organization for 30 years, or a secular organization, or you may move between those. So we want to prepare you for multiple spaces in your career. Now, in doing this course also, there's significant potential for students from different frameworks to get offended by each other's perspectives. We're not like these schools that are going to try to protect everyone from ever being offended. You're probably going to be offended by something in this course. And if you're not offended, then I don't know that you're learning well because the point is you have to stretch your boundaries. And our goal isn't to get everyone to agree, but to prepare you for your career. I'm not trying to offend people, but there's going to be some things that are going to offend people, right? So that's just a part of being grown-ups in a multicultural world, right? So there's this tendency of each multicultural framework to present itself as the framework rather than one of many frameworks. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. So what we're trying to do is present multiple frameworks towards multicultural counseling in the course that, and the fact that often each of these frameworks or each of these books, they don't actually recognize their own social location. They don't recognize the framework. So what I mean by social location, I'll kind of expand on that later, but it's what is the culture of the organization or the people who put together this material. So let me just, expand on that. So we have these three books in this course. They're actually coming from three different social locations, and they're coming from three different worldviews. So you have this one that's counseling. It's a clinical perspective. It's for licensed professional counselors in a secular environment. This is for addiction counselors. There's some really important class implications of how the field of addiction counseling is organized. It's very different, honestly, from licensed professional counselors. And then this urban ministry counseling perspective is also very different. These are all different social locations. Now, I want to introduce a concept of something called an Overton window. So, I said that the problem with most frameworks to multiculturalism is they present their framework as the framework rather than one of many frameworks. So the idea behind an Overton window is that every organization, every culture is going to have, norms and limits to debate. So, in our society, I think just about everyone can agree to things like Nazism is not something that should be promoted, right? So that's, unthinkable, radical. It's definitely not in the acceptable domain. But then there's things that are kind of in the popular domain. So if you're at a secular university, what's popular? What's the policy? what are things that might not be, popular, but they're sensible, and then acceptable, and then radical. So each organization and each of these books is going to have a different Overton window. So, counseling is written for secular universities. It's written for a secular counseling space, and they have their own Overton window of what's acceptable. The Healing for the City, this is urban ministry. This is, I think one of the authors, a black pastor. And so, he has his own Overton window, black pastor and counselor. And then in addiction counseling, it's kind of the same thing. Now, Noam Chomsky is a writer and critique of U.S. society. He's actually in the top 10 most quoted people of all time. And I think he was somewhere between Shakespeare. I think the Bible's number one. Shakespeare was like number five. I think he might have been either right before or right after Shakespeare in terms of his quotes. So part of the reason why I say that is he's someone to pay attention to. And he studied how thought control is done in the United States and in societies around the world. And what he says is the smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but to allow very lively debate within that spectrum. Even encourage the more critical and dissident views. That gives people the sense that there's free thinking going on, while all the time the presuppositions of the system are being reinforced by the limits put in the range of debate. So you're at a secular university, they say, we're going to really encourage you to think different so you can have debate all the way to the acceptable. But if you go to this radical or unthinkable, and part of the reason why this is important is some of these things out here might be the norms in Christian counseling at a lot of ministries. And it might be outside the norm. And there might be things, and this could be at a Christian counseling ministry there, it has its own Overton window, and there might be norms in the secular world that are different. So we got to be, as my pastor likes to say, big boys and girls, to be able to just understand that there's these different frameworks out there. So let's start with talking about what is City Vision's general approach towards integrating faith and counseling. Now, we recognize there's these differences in each organization. Each individual is going to have their own kind of Overton window. So within that, in counseling, in most of our courses, one of the dominant frameworks we're using is this Counseling in Christianity 5 approaches. So this side is, what we call the church gathered, not of the world in the Bible is what he says, and the church scattered is sent into the world. Now you have over here biblical counseling, then you have different schools, and you have this levels of explanation over here that's largely secular. And then there's other models within that. And these are all, hundreds of books have been written, different schools of counseling thought. And so this is primarily pastors and Christian counselors in churches. This is primarily Christian counselors in secular organizations. And then some of these might be Christian counselors in Christian organizations that take insurance, that have to be kind of in the middle, or might take Medicaid. So we have a pretty wide Overton window. I like to believe, and I actually think it's true, given the students that we have one of the widest Overton windows out of any university that I know. We expose students to a range of views, recognizing that what we're trying to do is to focus on, what I would call strong Christian worldview integration. So, we're going to take the best of clinical counseling, but we're going to also integrate that within a Christian worldview. And this range is pretty similar to the Lausanne Statement and Declaration on Care and Counseling, and it largely covers 95% of Bible-believing Christians globally. The Lausanne was a group that was founded by Billy Graham. So that's essentially what we're trying to do. And as you go across this, you get increased compatibility with the norms of secular counseling. Now, there's a similar framework that we use as we teach about multiculturalism. So you have on one side here is nearly all white, and another side that's nearly all non-white. This is around race, around race. And on one side you have, white fundamentalist Christians, and then you might have white evangelical ministries, and there's authors that you may recognize some of these down here. So, and this is the number of students that we have kind of within each of these. So white evangelical Christian ministries. Then you have this other group that I call reconcilees. So these are highly multi-ethnic, Bible-based ministries, and they're bridge building ministries. So like John Perkins is a good example of that, and kind of what I call CCDA 1.0, if you're familiar with the Christian Community Development Association. That's about 35% of our students. And then about another 35% are just working class students that are people of color. They're not, going to always be using the term reconciliation, but they're Bible-based Christians. And then there's this other group, to use a term that Du Bois coined, is the talented tenth. So that's going to be upper middle class people of color. And there's a lot of books that come out of InterVarsity Press more recently by people of color, for people of color, that's targeting that group. So and then you have secular radical identity political movements. So City Vision is going to span these four groups, but we're going to emphasize things aligned with our student population. Now, what's important to recognize is there's different Overton windows on this based on addiction counseling and LPC multicultural framework. So the LPC multicultural framework really is out here. It's going to, have a toe in the secular radical identity movements. It's going to really be focused largely on an upper middle class audience. Whereas addiction counseling, one of the strengths of addiction counseling is, you have peer support, you have all these tiers in the addiction counseling, SAMHSA's career ladder that allows a lot of people who have lived experience to be in the field. And that keeps it closer to street level. So I would say that's more of a working class, dominant culture. So that's the overall framework. These are what I would say, on race, some of the windows, that you have that. So as you go across, you have increased compatibility with the norms of secular counseling. So this is the core textbook. It's going to be in this domain. So you may be living over here and you may be uncomfortable over here, or you might be in this domain, so you're a little bit more comfortable with addiction counseling, or you may be over here and you may be less comfortable with the book that we have that's an urban ministry framework. So that's another way of viewing this. There's a third one, and that is what I call the race, class, and gender trilemma. So what is a trilemma? So a trilemma is where you have three factors, and basically you can't get all three. You can get one or two. So often, in project management, there's a trilemma, and there's a lot of different trilemmas. It's similar to a dilemma, but there's three factors. So, and what I've learned, and in working with hundreds of organizations, I've learned in studying this field for about 30 years, based on limitations of social location, culture, and frameworks, organizations tend to be only effective at one or two elements of race, class, and gender. Sometimes they're not effective across any of those three, right? So, but the addiction counseling framework, so this SAMHSA, they're really focused on street level. The point is to work with those who are recovering from addiction. Often addiction is strongly class correlated, but also whether they were lower income before. Often once they get addicted, they're lower income. So I would say that SAMHSA is taking a class-centric perspective. This book on developing a multicultural counseling framework is, if you look at what is the field of LPCs, it is the largest, I would say, cultural group within that are, middle class white women. Not that all of them are, that community is going to be there, but I would say if there's any kind of one group that's going to dominate that, it steers a little bit more white, a little bit more, middle class or upper middle class. Part of what the purpose of this book is and why this exists in KCREP's curriculum is because they're trying to move more towards race. They include class, but I think that there's problematic elements about the whole framework in terms of social class that I'm not going to get into right now. And then you have healing for the city. So on this, you have an urban ministry, Christian counseling, multicultural framework. I would say that one's the most racially centered. There might be some social class, and so each of these has a different social location. So there's a lot of different ways you could characterize the social location. But if you look at this race, class, and gender, trilemma or pyramid, this is my best kind of way of characterizing these books. So depending on where you personally live on this, some of these frameworks may or may not, fit you as well. So, so I mentioned, kind of a critique of this core textbook on LPCs and around social class. Now, part of the reason for that is there's really a social class hierarchy in counseling, and social class has huge worldview implications. So you kind of have this class hierarchy: the working poor, the working class, the upper middle class, the top 20%. So, you have peer specialists in addiction counseling. They're, at best, the working poor. Usually they're making kind of a poverty wage, often not even a living wage. And then you have the licensed addiction counselors. In a lot of places, they're getting a living wage, but the dominant culture there is really a working class culture. Within LPCs, a lot of the licensed clinical social workers, clinical psychologists, and sometimes the master addiction counselors, they're either middle class or upper middle class, kind of depending on the type of job that they have. And then, you have often within, this is kind of an org chart, say at an addiction treatment center. Often at the top, you have a psychiatrist or an MD, and they're making the big bucks. So you have kind of this social class hierarchy. And it's just important to recognize how that works. So now that's one framework. You also have another, so that's really talking about it from a social location. Now, the title of this also talks about worldview. So what do I mean by worldview? Well, I'm not going to give a full discussion on worldview. We have a video this week that talks a little bit about worldview, but it's really how do all the pieces of your view of the world fit together, especially the big picture. So you have a Christian worldview and you have a secular science worldview. So the base worldview, and there's names for these. So you have a Christian worldview, and in secular science, what it's called is secular scientific naturalism. And each of those has some philosophical implications on those terms. I'm not going to go into all of it, but naturalism means what you can see in nature is what you get, and scientific is you're going to follow the scientific method. And then you have a question, what's the fundamental problem? So for Christians, it's sin. Within the secular science worldview, it's going to be provided by whatever field you're in. If it's sociology, it could be, social dysfunction, but in psychology, it's psychopathology and counseling. And then the solution is, for Christians, it's salvation. Now, there's a whole lot of unpacking that, right? It's not just say the sinner's prayer. I think that, most of the groups we work with have a very holistic understanding of that. But then the solution generally is going to be different for each field. If you're an economist, the solution is getting an efficient economic system. If you're a sociologist, getting effective society. If you're a counselor, the solution is counseling. I mean, that's just how it works in any sort of field, right? So, who are we? Christians, it's in God's image, but also fallen. Secular science says that, we're thinking animals. We're just collection of atoms. Where we came from, God versus accidental cosmic chance. Where are we going? So that's the end times. The study's called I can't think of how to pronounce that right now. I need some more caffeine today. It varies by field, but, one example is where are we going, this kind of climate apocalypse. Well, whether or not, whatever you believe about the climate, the idea that science is determinatively saying that the way the world is going to end is because we're going to destroy it through the climate. That's not a scientific fact, right? So philosophy, spiritual, holistic. Here, the philosophy is materialistic, reductionistic, values, Bible-based. Secular scientific worldview pretends to be value-free, but that's false. There's always values. Saying you don't have values is kind of like saying you don't have culture or don't have a social location. How should I live? The summary of the Bible is love God, love others. Often secular science worldview is, individual pleasure maximizing or self-actualizing. Now, here's what's important about all of this worldview. This is not science. This is philosophical assumptions that science uses. And what assumptions you use, that's like putting on a lens, and that's going to shape the color of everything you see. Um, Science is a very, very useful tool. Spreadsheets are a useful tool, but I don't define every aspect of my life according to a spreadsheet. And it's similar, I think, in terms of the limitations of science. So with that, let me talk about, this is going to be related, but you need to understand in terms of worldview how universities are typically organized. So, and this relates to multicultural counseling in a huge way. So you have individual cultures and collective cultures, but then you have individual topics, disciplines that are focused more on the individual and disciplines that are focused more on the collective. And then you have people's internal experience and then external experience. So what does that really mean? Let me just go into it. So you have this quadrant one, that's the personal, it's nurture, it's largely the humanities fields. Then you have quadrant two, nature, science, and technology. So that is individual, and it's the external, so looking at your body, right? So this is the collective internal, so this is your culture, and this is the collective external, it's social sciences and systems. So what we're talking about here is you have different humanities, Western theology, ministry, but counseling's in this quadrant typically. So that's really important because that relates to this whole topic, because a lot of this topic is about attempts, multicultural counseling is about attempts to address the fact that counseling lives in this quadrant, and how do you think about these other quadrants. Then you have other things like biology, chemistry, physics, and then you have gender studies, cultural studies, ethics, and then you have, societal. So you have the micro level, organization and business management, microeconomics. Then you have the macro level, sociology, law, political science, economics. So whenever you're talking about systemic issues, often systemic are these macro issues, and these are, personal issues. So what does all that mean? And I'm not going to go into the full detail. We go into deeper detail on this in other courses, but you can take these various lenses to try to understand the causes of addiction. So you have personal causes that might help or might increase someone's propensity towards addiction. And then you have physical causes. So you might have, that's where, some people say it's all genes. Some people say it's all, personal choice, or it's all, some of these other factors. There's cultural. You have, addiction cultures, right? And then you have societal. So all these, this is really understanding a holistic causes of addiction, right? So all these are interpreted through a Christian worldview. But then what you can do is you can also say, okay, how do you have a 4-quadrant approach to treating addiction? So with that, there's different things you can do on the personal level. There's different things you can do, on the physical level, like, medication or things along those lines. There's different things you can do on a cultural level, spiritual revival, creating a healthy church, working in a healthy church. And then there's societal level. And ultimately, what the Christian worldview is that, its dependence on God is the organizing paradigm of this. So, okay, why is that important? Well, I'm showing you this lens here. Everything has a lens. So if you take a worldview like secular scientific positivism, and that's really, what that means is you're going to follow the scientific method, and positivism means only things that you can prove, generally numerically, are true. And, I can't prove that I love my wife numerically. So does that mean it's not true, right? There's a lot of things that kind of fall into that category. So you take that and you apply it to addiction, you get a very different result because you have a different lens. So you do that, and you have some, these, hold on. Okay, sorry, I had to fix the slide. The whole point of scientific positivism is the internal dimension, how you're feeling, all those things, is they're not real because they can't be proven quantitatively. The external is really all that exists. So if you take that and you just say, let's ignore this based on our philosophical assumption, then you end up with certain results. You say, okay, the result is we have to focus, if you have a problem like overdose deaths, then there's one solution, and it's harm reduction. And you're going to have methadone, you're going to do, Narcan, you're going to have medication-assisted treatment. And then, on the societal level, you're going to have safe injection sites, you're going to have safe alternative to opioids. Now, I'm not saying these aren't a part of a holistic solution. All I'm saying is if you put a lens on these things of positivism and you have a worldview, these are the main solutions that are going to come out. Whenever, if you go back to, a more holistic view of everything, then you get, much wider, results of, what can you do? There's a lot more on a holistic approach here than you get in terms of just harm reduction. So that's one example of why worldview is really important. Now, why am I bringing that up in a multicultural counseling? Well, that's also going to approach your worldview is going to influence your approach to multicultural counseling. So let me just use another example. If you take a worldview, say, of a rescue mission versus a secular home shelter, you will have a holistic Christian worldview versus secular scientific positivism, and you end up with different approaches. So your practical theology you're applying is a Christian holistic approach, and there you're applying quantitative best practices in harm reduction. You got the fundamental problem. I showed you the holistic Christian 4-quadrant, and then you have the approach is lack of housing plus overdose deaths. The solution is salvation plus holistic needs versus physical interventions, housing plus medical. Who do you serve? Some ministries might be a dry shelter, people who are ready for change, anyone, a low barrier shelter. Programs, you have a shelter plus Christian recovery, and then you have housing first plus methadones plus safe injections are your programs. And then your primary funding, might be different, and then you have different outcomes that you focused on. So why is this important? Is recognizing that what lens you apply is going to give you different outcomes. Now, what happens in this field is each of these books, each of these worldviews can essentially be accused of cultural imperialism. So as Christians, Christians get accused of cultural imperialism all the time. Well, everyone has a social location. We always try to impose that on other people. That's just the way people work. We try to do it less. But the reality is, I don't want any one of these books to, be doing a cultural imperialism onto you. Now, if you're going to work in the field of counseling, you got to follow its rules. If you're going to work in urban ministry, you got to follow its rules. If you're going to work in addiction counseling, you got to follow its rules. So you need to be able to do all of those things. Now, there's these competency maps, and this is used in the tip 57 by SAMHSA, Improving Cultural Competence. And let me just talk about the dimensions of this. So first of all, they're showing 3 dimensions: individual, clinical, and organizational. So that's great. And some will add a societal, right? And then you have different dimensions: cultural awareness, cultural knowledge of behavioral health, and then cultural skill development. And this is honestly basically how the addiction counseling field is. Skills, knowledge is basically the 2 things. Then you have this across different cultural groups, right? I would say that the lens of the field of addiction counseling and the lens of licensed professional counseling, because it goes through the secular academic world, the secular university world, that tends to overemphasize cognitive knowledge. Now, I love cognitive knowledge, really important. The fact that 3 of their building blocks are really knowledge, to me, is kind of funny, because usually that's one of the building blocks whenever I draw these diagrams. So it's not, it's like you're going to have a balanced diet and you have 3 helpings of meat and, 1 helping of something else, right? So that's kind of what I feel like traditional academic worldview does, and that translates into a lot of the counseling worldview. This is City Vision's approach, right? So cultural knowledge is important. If you just study learning theory, this is kind of like learning theory 101. You have cognitive, you have the affective, and you have head, heart, and hands. Essentially, is what it is. So the framework that's used in this course for two of the textbooks, the SAMHSA one and the multicultural competencies, really emphasizes these black domains, whereas City Vision is going to emphasize all four of these. And so let me just kind of expand on this. So the heart is really important, but then the other part is identity. In counseling, you teach about cognitive behavioral therapy, and you teach these other things, but you have worldview and belief, and at the core of that is your identity, right? So you can do things around knowledge, but at the end of the day, what you're really trying to do is change someone's identity. So and then City Vision has a lot of other courses I mentioned in the previous video that deal with the organizational level, but one of the things we're going to try to do in this course is we're going to emphasize a little bit more of the heart. So you're going to be going through journaling, and you're like, why am I doing a lot of journaling? Well, a lot of the work of growth here is heart level work. So that's what we're trying to get you to do. You're going to have these discussion forums. A lot of it is heart level work. So, and part of the reason why that's important is I've worked with, honestly, thousands of people in cross-cultural context. And if I had to say, what's the biggest problem that I see of approaches to multiculturalism, it's they focus in one of the readings is this cultural identity development process. This is kind of a simplification of various ethnic identity development or process, but there's this unawareness, and they focus on head learning, the awareness, but they never get to the next level, the heart and hand learning. That happens through immersion. And then you get to this other level where you go through immersion, and then what I call is holiness, and that's where your identity is being transformed. So let's just say you move to France, and so you can learn a lot about French stuff from books. You can learn a lot of a lot of the French language. You move to France, things are going to change a lot. Hopefully you learn, say you're in Paris, you learn to love Paris, right? So your heart is changing, you're learning, through immersion, but at some point, they talk about you're dreaming in French, and everything. So, and you're fluent in French, and, that's where you're getting to this stage 4. Now, here's the problem with these academic approaches to multicultural competence. I found that in ministry, one of the principles I've seen, I've heard this quoted by pastors, arrogance often comes from knowledge outstripping your experience. Humility often comes from experience outstripping knowledge. Now, the problem is that academic approaches to multicultural competence is they just stuff your head with all this head learning, and then it just kind of makes people arrogant because you have a lot of stuff, but you've never lived in France. You've never been to, France, right? So you have to have this immersion. You have to have this internal transformation. And so ultimately what that happens is if you take this traditional academic approach to multicultural competency, it results in students' multicultural knowledge outstripping their experience. And that can lead to arrogance rather than humility. And what it can do is it can inoculate students from deeper growth. So you're like, man, I've read 50 books about cross-cultural stuff. Well, you still might be a jerk cross-culturally. You still may not be fluent cross-culturally. Your heart may still be in the wrong spot. You may still have the wrong identity. Ultimately, that's the problem with these typical academic approaches, and that's what we're trying to change. Most of our students are immersed in cross-cultural context, so they're already getting this. So the head part's going to be helpful. Now, let me talk about another term that's often used in cross-cultural circles. Code switching is when someone learns to switch languages and or cultures in different environments to accommodate the dominant culture in a particular context. So, a lot of my black friends, they, will they'll be in the black church, and they will code switch between how they act, say, at the black church, and whenever they're in, say, a white business context, and they have to essentially, code switch between those. Now, that's also true for Christian counselors in secular contexts. So, you might be a Christian counselor in a Christian context. You're going to have to code switch into that secular context. You're going to have to follow their rules. And that's why, you have to learn all of these frameworks. If you're in the addiction counseling field, you got to know its framework. If you're in secular, LPC world, you got to follow its framework. The biblical principle is, let everyone be subject. So it's Romans 13:1. Let everyone be subject to governing authorities, for there's no authority except that which God has established, and the authorities that exist that have been established by God. Now, you can just look at this from a boundaries perspective. If you go in someone else's house, you follow their rules. So if you're in the LPC house, you want to become a licensed professional counselor, you have to follow its rules. If you want to become an addiction counselor, you got to follow its rules. If you want to go into an urban ministry, you got to follow its rules. So consider what authority you're going to come under and submit to those that you choose to come under. That's kind of the principle. And code switch. That doesn't mean you have to be two different people. It doesn't have to be that you're lying. It just means that, hey, you're bilingual. You go into a Spanish community, you're going to speak Spanish. You're going to speak English, and you learn these different rules. So that's one of the key concepts. Hopefully all these principles are helpful for you. I want you to have a few takeaways. One is this course is trying to help you grow, trying to help you be more effective cross-culturally and multiculturally in counseling context or whatever context that you're serving in. Some of that's going to require, some growth and change, but we're not trying to reprogram you in ways that don't respect who God's made you to be, your own unique identity. And we want to start with wherever you are, but all of us have room to grow. And, hopefully this course will be helpful for you in this. So in this week, there's going to be a lot of journaling, a lot of discussing these concepts. Get it out there. Get how you feel out there on these things. There may be different frameworks that you're very comfortable with, and then others that aren't. So we want this to be a safe place where you can dialogue about that. So hopefully all this will be helpful. Hopefully through this lecture also you'll feel like that you can come in where you are. Jesus always meets us where we are. But he also asks us to go somewhere. So that's essentially what we're trying to do in this course with you. So hopefully all this is helpful. If you have questions, please ask your faculty member.